By the late 12th century BCE, the once mighty Mycenae was a shadow of its former self, standing on its last legs as the Bronze Age collapse was unfolding on the Greek mainland. The glorious days of famed Mycenaean kings were now a thing of a past, with the Achaean rulers now rather focused on defending their declining realm against the continuous incursions. As the linear B-writing system ceased to exist in the first half of the century, we are not left with much evidence of the exact course of events, besides the oral tradition which persisted through the generations until the appearance of the Hellenic alphabet centuries later. As the aging king Orestes died in 1124 BCE, he was succeeded by his son Tisamenus, the final ruler of the Mycenaean era. By the time Tisamenus ascended to the throne, the Mycenaean realm included the territories of Mycenae, Tiryns and Argos, as well as Laconia, which was largely abandoned by this time except for a few minor settlements. Also apparently aligned to the Mycenaean rulers, at least nominally, were the rulers in Arcadia, Messenia and to some extent Aegaleia, although it is difficult to determine how much influence, if any, the king of Mycenae really held within these areas. To the north, the anti-Mycenaean sentiment grew strong, especially in the areas controlled by the Heracleidae, the descendants of legendary Heracles, who had for the past century been trying to overtake the Mycenaean rulers and seize Peloponnese for themselves. The Heraclidae laid their claims on the Peloponnese based on their lineage, as Heracles himself was of the same Perseid bloodline as his rival Eurystheus, the last king of Mycenae of the previous century, before the throne was ultimately taken by Atreus, who founded his own dynasty called the Atreids, which became the subsequent Mycenaean rulers. Throughout the end of the 13th and the first half of the 12th century BCE, multiple Heraclid attempts were made to conquer Peloponnese, including those of Heracles' son Hylas and Hylas' own son Cleodias. Ultimately, all those attempts proved unsuccessful, as the Mycenaean kings still had more than enough power to deal with their northern enemies. However, by the end of the 12th century BCE, the overall political landscape was drastically different from what it used to be, not only in Greece but throughout the known world. Series of invasions by the new tribes, including those of the so-called Sea Peoples, as well as widespread economic turmoil and isolation, brought to an end a number of long-lasting Bronze Age kingdoms, effectively ending the era of the Bronze Age. In Greece, the aftermath of the Trojan War brought nothing but internal struggle and wars that had left the region devastated and in ruins. Many of the Achaean nobles decided to leave their homeland and pursue a new land to settle, together with their companions and followers. Among those was King Tisamenus' half-brother Pentheus, who had already departed for Asia during the reign of Orestes. In such circumstances, the declining Peloponnese was left vulnerable to hostile incursions, with several Dorian enclaves already established in the region, an opportunity that the Heraclid leaders had long been waiting for. Tisamenus himself, however, was firm not to cave in to the enemy, and the king almost immediately started preparing for war. The Heracleidae, which had traditionally aligned themselves with the Thessalian ancestors of the Dorians, had by now reached widespread support of the Dorian contingents, including those of the mountainous region of Doris, the core area of the Dorian tribes. The leader of the Heraclidae was Aristomachus, the son of Cleodias and the great-grandson of Heracles. Aristomachus raised his army, which mainly consisted of the Dorian tribesmen, and after consulting the oracle of Delphi, was given a direction that he should attack through the narrow passage. As the only obvious narrow passage was the Isthmus of Corinth, Aristomachus moved through Boeotia and marched on Peloponnese through the very same route which his predecessors Hylas and Cleodias attempted in the generations before. Upon reaching the Isthmus of Corinth, Aristomachus was met with a Cyclopean-style wall which was being constructed to block the passage, as well as the Mycenaean army led by King Tisamenus. The battle was as bloody and devastating as any of the previous wars, but the victorious were once again the Mycenaeans. King Tisamenus achieved his first big triumph of his reign, and the defeated Aristomachus was laying dead on the battlefield. Tisamenus's victory, however, came at a great cost, as a good portion of his army, as well as many of his generals, were also among the fallen. As the Mycenaean army during this period likely numbered no more than several thousand troops, it was obvious that any further wars were hardly sustainable for the Mycenaean rulers. In the following years, further Achaean colonial expeditions were taken overseas, as many Mycenaeans set sail for Asia and Cyprus, preferring to search for a new homeland rather than to stay in the war-torn Peloponnese, with new invasions constantly looming on the Mycenaean doorstep. Among those Mycenaeans was Tisamenus's eldest son, Cometes, who together with his followers set sail for Asia Minor. The other four sons of Tisamenus were Diomenes, Spartan, Telis, and Leontomenes, all of which decided to stay in Argolis together with their father. Meanwhile, in Doris and Thessaly, another Heracleid coalition was being assembled by the three sons of the deceased Aristomachus. The three leaders, being Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus, were now joined by various Dorian contingents. Another significant ally of the Heraclidae was King Eutesian of Thebes, who gave his daughter Argeia in marriage to Aristodemus and subsequently arrived with the Boeotian troops. The coalition was thus assembled near Delphi, where the Heracleid leaders went to consult the oracle before proceeding with the expedition. As Temenus complained to the oracle that his predecessors had failed despite following the oracle's lead, the clarification was issued that the oracle did not refer to the Isthmus of Corinth as originally thought, but to the narrow straits of Rhion, which separated Phocis from the northern Peloponnese. As the Heracleid army arrived to the nearby Naupactus and started building its ships, the camp was hit by a major storm which destroyed a portion of the fleet. Among the casualties was none other than one of the three brothers, Aristodemus. Clearly a bad omen and a setback for the Heraclidae, forced Temenus to once again go to the oracle for yet another consultation. After receiving new instructions, which apparently included a divine sacrifice and the banishment of one of the Heracleid nobles, Temenus was joined by yet another ally, an Aetolian contingent led by Oxylus. Now everything was set and ready for Temenus, who after two attempts by Hylas, one by Cleodias and one by Aristomachus, led the fifth Heracleid attack against the Atreid kings of Mycenae. In 1104 BCE, the Heracleid fleet first moved from Naupactus to Antyrion, and then crossed to Rhion on the Peloponnesian side, unloading there and establishing the war camp. Upon hearing the news, King Tisamenus assembled his army and marched north in order to face the invaders. The Mycenaean army consisted of the detachments from Argolis and Laconia, as well as the allied contingents from Messenia and Arcadia. As Tisamenus approached northern Peloponnese, the two armies finally met each other in an open battle, both confident of victory and a decisive outcome. Unlike the many attempts where the Heraclidae were defeated time and time again, this time the fortune proved to be on their side, as the once mighty Mycenaeans were finally doomed to fail. Although courageous and persistent, the forces of Tisamenus were ultimately destroyed, and the king himself perished in the battle. The news of the Mycenaean defeat quickly spread throughout Peloponnese, which came as a shock to the remaining Achaean leaders. Tisamenus himself marched to Argolis, where he sacked the heavily declined Mycenae and proclaimed the so-called return of the Heracleidae. The agreement was soon reached with the four sons of Tisamenus, who agreed to leave Argolis with their Achaean followers and avoid further war. In what was famously called the Lot of Tisamenus, the Heraclid leaders decided on how to divide Peloponnese into their own realms. The Aetolian ally Oxylus received Elis, where he moved together with some of the defeated Achaeans in order to establish his own kingdom. Tisamenus' younger brother, Cresphontes, received Messenia, which was soon occupied by the Heraclid troops, expelling the reigning Nelate clan, which eventually took refuge in Athens. The region around Sparta was to be divided by Aristodemus' children, the two twin sons Eurysthenes and Procles. As the two boys were still infant, the regency was given to their uncle, Argea's brother Theras, who arrived to Laconia and started establishing the Dorian settlements in Lacedaemon. Tisamenus himself was declared the king of Argos, where he moved his capital, which he favored over the former royal seats such as Mycenae and Tiryns. His sphere of influence was to be all of Argolis, Cynuria, and all the way southwards, including the island of Cythera. The remaining region of Arcadia was left alone, as the Heraclids and Dorians were not too numerous themselves, having already stretched too thin across Peloponnese, and were barely enough to settle in enclaves throughout the areas they assigned to each other. Thus, the Mycenaean era finally came to an end, with Greece entering the period of the Dark Ages. In the future episodes, we will go through this little attested period that represented a new chapter in the Hellenic history. Please consider subscribing and sharing the video, as this is a one-person production and it greatly helps the visibility of the channel. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, Chris Ernst, Panayotis Yiannopoulos, Fred Leckie, and Estate Care for their continuous support. If you wish to join our Patreon community, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we'll see you again soon.